Welcome everyone to our session today entitled Recruiting and Rebuilding Your Volunteer Base. I'm thrilled to be here with you and your facilitator today. My name is Beth Steinhorn and I am president of VQ Volunteer Strategies. I am a partner with Better Impact, and I'm really glad to have been invited actually as a guest presenter for this webinar by Better Impact. VQ Volunteer Strategies works with organizations across North America exclusively on volunteer engagement strategy, and I'm thrilled to be joining you from our office HQ in Denver, Colorado. And again, I'd like to just welcome you all to explore over the next 55 minutes with me the topic of recruitment. A few notes about this session. While all participants have been automatically muted upon entry, that does not mean that I don't want this to be an interactive and participatory experience. Please do use the chat. I'm very good at monitoring chat and presenting. There will be time for questions at the end, but if there is a pressing question, I will try and address it in the moment if it has to do with the content I'm presenting at that time. Otherwise, feel free to put your questions in, and we should have about 10 minutes at the end for discussion and Q&A, plus a little poll in the center. There will be a handout which will be provided by our hosts, Better Impact and Micah. We'll make that available to you by the end of the session. And as you may have heard upon joining, this is being recorded, and the recording will be available through Better Impact following the session. So let's get started. For those who have been on any trainings with me before, and I recognize a few names, perhaps, it won't surprise you that I like to start my session with a bit of a story. Recruitment, as I'll share in a moment, is a really big issue this year in particular among volunteer involving organizations. And so that is why a number of months ago, when I was presenting on this topic or talking about recruitment challenges, and a participant noted in the chat that she was really having some success in recruitment, and furthermore, I noticed that it was a CASA, Court-Appointed Special Advocates, which is an organization that requires significant training and commitment by volunteers. I was intrigued and very impressed.
Why
so be
can't
careful
I hear?
Be careful what you post. You can, if you are having any auditory problems, please keep yourself muted, and you're not gonna be able to hear me, but you can message Micah and he might be able to help with that. In any case, fortunately, this woman from CASA Orange County was willing to speak with me. And so I really want to share some of the strategies that Tara Dempster of CASA OC shared with me, because we'll be building on those throughout the session. One of the reasons, as I indicated, that I was so intrigued by her message was that recruiting volunteers to be a court-appointed special advocate, a role that is core to CASA work, is one that poses many of the biggest challenges to volunteer recruitment today. First of all, the commitment is an intense one, both lots of hours for training initially and a long-term commitment. Due to the huge need for advocates, many CASAs, Orange County included, need to recruit high volume in order to even chip away at the really long waiting list that so many agencies are facing. For CASA OC, the year that Tara joined, they had sworn in 128 new volunteers, which may sound impressive, but it was way under target for them. In this fiscal year, they seek to recruit 155 high-quality volunteers, not only 155, but 155 new volunteers that better reflect the diversity of the children that they serve in Orange County. And each individual is required to complete 34 hours of training, followed by 10 to 15 hours per month of commitment. And then Tara also mentioned kind of a policy issue, a practice issue, which was that there had been a lag time between inquiry and training. While info sessions were offered frequently 4 times a month, at CASA OC, they offered training sessions only every other month. That meant if someone inquired the day or week right after the most recent training session, they'd have to wait maybe another 8 weeks in order to participate. Now, they've since changed that. That was one of the challenges that was in place. So what were the strategies that Tara employed? First, she really took the opportunity as a new volunteer engagement professional to network. She joined the organization in 2021 after having been a volunteer advocate, but this was her first volunteer engagement role. And I'm seeing across the board that there are many, many new members of our volunteer engagement profession. If you are relatively new to the field, let's say 3 years or fewer, maybe you can do a little thumbs up using the emoticons, and I'll just scan across all of our 130 plus participants. I see a few new ones. Welcome, Christina and Miranda and Jill, lots of newbies, Kara, Evelyn, lots and lots of new folks in the field. So welcome, and you are not alone. I am seeing this across the country. So she really networked the heck out of it and said, I'm going to meet a lot of people and get to know and learn about this field. Second, she adjusts, oh, more thumbs up in the chat. Rachel, Shelley, Tori, wonderful. Welcome. Second, she adjusted protocols. For example, to become a CASA in California, as I've mentioned, one must complete 34 hours of training. The interview didn't happen until after training. And through her advocacy, they shifted that to before training so that they could really begin building the relationship with the individual from the first moment that they reached out. They streamlined. As a result of these trainings, as a result of these shifted protocols, they really have increased retention. And then finally, they invested in, sorry, not finally, second to last, they invested in new processes to create community. I've been hearing since start of the pandemic, Beth, how do we create community within a volunteer corps that may be working in a hybrid, partly remote, partly in person, and arena? And CASA OC was no different. Recognizing the experience of being a male CASA in particular is very different. CASA OC piloted affinity groups for male advocates, providing support and investing in events where they encourage male CASAs to bring a friend, and that's really increased recruitment. And finally, they leveraged personas as a strategy for recruitment. And I'm going to be sharing a lot more about that once we really dive into the material. So stay tuned. That's going to be the final piece that I'll be sharing, along with some tools to help you leverage that approach as well. First, I'd like to really dive in and give you a sense of trends, what's happening in terms of recruitment, see how that stacks up with your own experience. I'll share some strategies that align with many of the things that CASA OC implemented that I've alluded to. And finally, we'll have time for discussion. So let's dive in. I like to start with trends because it helps you understand the landscape in which you're working. And you may not need me to tell you that recruitment is hard. Otherwise, you might not be here. But I'm going to start with some research so you can share these data points with your colleagues, your leadership, your peers, to ensure that everyone understands that you're not alone if you are, in fact, facing some challenges. So this report, which was published in early 2023, is a real landmark report called The State of Volunteer Engagement, Insights from Nonprofit Leaders and Funders. It's a landmark study that is the first of its kind that not only involved over 1,200 nonprofit chief executives, but also 103 funders. And it builds some benchmarks, first to build on some other previous research, but also really benchmarks for the future. And what are some of the things that we learned on this state of volunteer engagement insights? First, we've seen that in the past year, 64% of nonprofits have reported an increase in demand for their services, and nearly half have said that their staff workload has grown. However, almost a third, 29%, little less than a third, reported operating with less funding and paid staff than before the pandemic, and 40% were operating with about the same level. So that's 71% who are operating with the same or fewer resources despite this increase in demand for services. In other words, organizations continue to be strapped in many ways in order to get the work done, get more work done with the same or fewer resources. I, of course, look at that and say, well, volunteers are the answer. More volunteers or more of the right volunteers with the right skills and availability can be the way to address that. And yet, same research shows that between 2019 and 2022, organizations are finding it harder to identify and recruit volunteers during the workday than to find volunteers with the needed skills. Twice as many or twice the percentage from 2019 for each of those data points. Harder to find volunteers times we need them and with the skills we need them. There's also a disconnect between, in case you're interested in trying to get funding to support this, it's interesting to note that while nearly half of nonprofit CEOs believe lack of volunteers is a big problem, among funders, that percentage is much less. So if you're involved in soliciting funds or advocating with your fund development partners at your organization, try and get funding to support volunteer engagement as a strategy, recognize that we as nonprofit or organizational leaders need to make the case and share data like this with our potential funders so they understand that this is a very real problem. And it's not just from the State of Volunteerism report. This challenge was also highlighted in the 2023 Volunteer Management Report. Among the top challenges when asked in an open-ended question to volunteer managers around the world, what's your number one biggest volunteer management challenge right now? 1 out of 3, 33% said, 33% said recruitment. Here are the other ones: time, respect and buy-in, roles and matching. And you can see that they trail significantly behind recruitment. The last few data points I'll share is that this isn't just something that we heard in 2021. Even in 2022, nearly 70% of nonprofits are engaging fewer volunteers than normal in 2022. And normal, we're never going to go back to normal, but and some organizations, like I spent my early part of my career working in museums. I saw a few museum folks in the chat. Yay, museums. And the museum where I worked for a dozen years had for decades engaged on average 1,800 to 2,000 volunteers, but really right-sized that through the pandemic and now regularly engage about 850 to 900. They figured out that a better number for the volunteers and even more importantly, for the mission of the organization, their staff, their curators, collections managers, education staff, it's really about 850. So that was a strategic decision to recruit fewer and sustain fewer, but that's the exception rather than the rule. We see that it's not just numbers of volunteers, but also the amount of hours they're contributing. This is courtesy of Star of the Sea Foundation in Florida, which was an organization I recently had the pleasure of certifying as a service enterprise organization. And they showed that just from January to May, I know it's a little small and hard to see, but on the left, between January and May of, I guess that was 2022, their volunteer hours have decreased. So it's not just number of volunteers, but the number of hours that they're each contributing has gone down, while meanwhile, the number of clients continues to go up. So there's a real life example of the data I was sharing. We also have, just complicating these factors, we have the Great Resignation. Throughout 2022, 4 million employees resigned each month throughout most of last year, which means you're also facing colleagues, even if you're not new, so welcome to those who are to the field, you're partnering with colleagues who may have no history of engaging with volunteers, which also leads to burnout, right? Of course, I see burnout as, again, an opportunity to engage volunteers, to provide relief staff, build capacity beyond what staff alone can achieve, and free staff up do the work they're uniquely qualified for. These are all issues that still make it challenging. Of course, least of which is not the least of which is the fact that the volunteer rates in the United States have plummeted between 2017 and 2021 from over 30% to roughly 23%. We believe that will continue to rebuild and get back up to some closer level to pre-pandemic levels, but it's hard out there. All of that data is really to show it's hard out there. So what I want to leave you with is not a helpless, gosh, I'm not alone, it's hard to recruit, but really share some strategies that will help you overcome it. I definitely have suggestions around that. And as much as I love planning, my suggestions don't begin with developing a volunteer recruitment plan. There's no quick fix. So we have to consider all sorts of other elements before developing our recruitment plan. And I've made it somewhat easy for you to remember them. They all begin with P. We're going to start with policy and perspective. We're going to move on to positions, practice, personas, and finally get planning. And before I dive in, I want to address Jill's note. Do I know if the numbers are similar in Canada? My research, as I do work with Canadian organizations, thank you for raising that, has not revealed a lot, same level of more recent data as we've seen in the data that I shared for Canada, but all my work with having interviewed organizations across Canada is that it is similar. You in Canada started out with a much higher rate of volunteerism. You have a much higher rate than here in the States. But there was absolutely globally, and there's a great report recently by Giving Tuesday, the Giving Tuesday report. I'll try and come up with the name of it, but if you do Giving Tuesday 2022 report, you'll find there's a global report on volunteerism rates, and globally volunteerism dropped significantly in obviously between 2020 and 2023, 2022. So I would say yes, very similar in Canada, though you're starting off at a stronger place than your neighbors to the south. Thank you for asking. So let's start with policy and perspectives. Some of you may know or have heard of Rob Jackson, who is a consultant out of the UK. He's a colleague and a wonderful leader. And he published a blog a number of months ago that really, back in February, that really resonated with me. He talked about not just how COVID-19 lockdowns have affected volunteering, but also the cost of living crisis, which is not unique to the US or the UK. It's happening in a lot of parts of the globe. And he talked about the fact that it's so tempting organizations, and I see this in my work, to simply go back to the fundamentals, which sounds really logical. Let's go back to recruitment and retention. But doing more of the same isn't necessarily the answer. None of these approaches would work in a context where attitudes to volunteering have shifted. In other words, just broadcasting your messages more loudly or putting it out in more places isn't necessarily going to be the answer. As he wrote so compellingly, the world has changed and so must we. Because if the roles we want volunteers to do aren't flexible and impactful enough, then however well-crafted and fancy-looking our recruitment campaign is, we will struggle to engage new volunteers. Because in a cost of living crisis, if we don't make available the funds to reimburse volunteer expenses, then people won't volunteer because they simply can't afford the out-of-pocket expense to subsidize our work. Because if we're not prepared and set up to be flexible, to let volunteers take a break, switch roles, to walk away, then our retention efforts will stall and likely fail. And here's where I think it's really compelling. We keep volunteers by being open to letting them go, not hanging on to them for dear life. We keep volunteers by being willing to let them go, not hanging on to them for dear life. So what is all of that mean in our practices, our policies and protocols and our perspective? It means that we need to think about what are the barriers to engagement. Are your prospective volunteers put off or experiencing hurdles because of transportation costs, because of limited access to technology, because of inaccessible requirements? Are you requiring people to commit to a full year and that's hundreds of hours in order to even be considered a volunteer? If you're a CASA, an advocate, that may be necessary because they want to match youth in need with CASAs, advocates who are going to stay with them through the course of their case. And that may take an entire year or more. But if you're a food pantry organization or an animal shelter or any sort of other organization, maybe even an advocacy or civic engagement organization, are there ways that volunteers can engage by making your requirements much more accessible? Are there inflexible requirements? Are you still requiring, or are you back to requiring in-person engagement when you really could be doing virtual? And are there other barriers? For CASA OC, they are looking at funding sources to help with reimbursements for gas cards because gas in California was so expensive, particularly when I was interviewing Tara earlier this year. Please feel free to use in the chat any sort of messages or any sort of notes that you have regarding your barriers that you are looking at that may be preventing volunteers from engaging with you or just making it harder. Feel free to share those, as I said, in the chat. The other piece is perspective, policy and perspective. What are we considering success? Is it success if a volunteer comes and stays for a year or for 2 years or for 3 years or for 5 months? Or are you looking at recruitment success and kind of the whole pipeline? For example, are you tracking the number of inquiries, applications, interviews, attendance at orientation, placements, successful placements, or other? For example, I was working with an animal shelter years ago, and she said, "Oh, our retention is really low." I said, "Tell me about that." She goes, "Well, we get it's an animal shelter. They often have fewer challenges with recruitment, and this was a couple of years ago. We get basically on average 100 volunteers at each orientation, but only 65 sign up to be a volunteer." I said, "That's not retention, and that's not failure. That means that you have successfully in your orientation educated 35 prospective volunteers so that they can make a decision that this isn't the right role for them, before you have invested time in training them. But you have successfully inspired 65 feel comfortable that this is the right role for them and to then formally apply and take the training and be part of the organization." So what is success for you and how are you measuring that? I'm looking at the chat and I'm seeing a couple other barriers: age requirements, familiarity with long-term care environment, and confidence of volunteers. Some are quite intimidated. I'm not going to remember this verbatim, but I have a guest presenter tomorrow who's going to be just sharing a message on another training I'm doing that they shared about, I think it's with similar type of organization, where they basically are sharing a recruitment message where they're acknowledging that the work is hard, but it's worth it. And I love that they're upfront and it's no bait and switch. It's hard work, but it's going to be worth it work for you. Lots of Kara talks about required list of clearances that can't budge. Yep, I understand that, and that can be important and important to acknowledge. And then you have to just recruit to those percentages. Staff interactions, I'm intrigued by that, but I won't go down that road. I think that to me sounds like you have some training of your fellow staff so that they understand their role in recruitment. So feel free to read and comment on your colleagues' answers in the chat. But this policy and perspective, I think, is really key. Here's another way that one organization, National MS Society of Colorado and Wyoming, really relooked at their success. So in late 2020, I heard from my colleague Brittany, who was at the time the MS Society's Colorado, Wyoming volunteer specialist. And she was particularly that time responsible for recruiting day of event volunteers, MS walks, MS bikes, other types of events. Well, of course, all the events were canceled. But because MS leadership had made a statement in March of 2020 stating our priority is to stay connected until we can be together again, that gave Brittany the empowerment to reach out to all of the volunteers on her list with a survey, asking them what their interest is, what their needs are. She sent it to all of the volunteers in her market. And anyone who said that they were interested in doing a different type of role. Now, this wasn't the role she was responsible for. She was the event volunteer coordinator, but she coordinated with her other colleagues and said, look, our event volunteers don't have anything to do for the foreseeable future. It would be success if we could elevate them to a committee or a task force or some other role, or at least keep them on a short list or on a list for short-term advocacy opportunities. Anyone who expressed interest in any of that, she was empowered to take time to have a one-on-one meeting with. And then she was able to, within just a few weeks, elevate dozens of volunteers to event committees, advocacy work, community councils, and created a running list of people interested in making phone calls, writing thank you notes, and other short-term projects. And some were those who'd been there for 10 years or more, just as an event volunteer. This gave them the opportunity to think differently. And even though her numbers went down, the organization as a whole was more connected and more successful. So that perspective was a major shift. Let's go on to positions. You can't revitalize recruitment and make it work if what you are recruiting volunteers to do isn't appealing. So I've shared many times, it's when I've presented and talked about volunteer engagement, that my Venn diagram, my mental image for what a strategic role is. And it's the overlap between what volunteers are interested in and available to do today and your organization's needs and priorities. Where the roles for volunteers are strategic are in that sweet overlap spot between the two. And since many volunteers or prospective volunteers have revised what they want, that target of overlap has moved, which means we need to think differently as well. We have to think differently, because if you use this chart, this Venn diagram, literally or just sort of some version of it in 2019, the world is different. So we need to be different. As an example, I'll go back to my museum roots for the moment. I've been working with many museums in recent years who've been rethinking and restructuring positions accordingly, because what used to work and be appealing isn't working anymore. And this was well in the works prior to the pandemic. Think about what visitors want. More often, short interactions rather than a dedicated 40-minute tour or 1-hour tour. And this takes a different type of person, someone who's willing to ask questions rather than know all the answers. And that affects training. If we want volunteering to be accessible, then we need to look at training requirements. So more and more museums are thinking about their what often has been long-standing, decades-long expectations that volunteers take 2 years of training in order to be deemed a volunteer docent, a tour guide. Instead, streamlining that training so that they're trained as a facilitator. Ask questions, not provide all the answers. It makes the requirements and the accessibility to volunteering much wider, which also helps to diversify the volunteer corps in terms of age, because of people who are working, economic status, all sorts of different things. Well, and we'll go back to our colleague Tara from CASA OC. While nationally, being a CASA advocate requires at least 30 hours of training, there's no national regulation when it comes to museum roles. And for many of your organizations, there's no national regulation. But even for CASA and other organizations like it, I've worked with organizations that have state mandated training, say for volunteers who are going to work a crisis line for people experiencing sexual trauma or sexual abuse. They have to take 30 hours of training. Some of that training can be done virtually, while other must be done in person. And even that shift opens up the accessibility to more and more people, which leads us in rethinking positions to how that plays out when we think about practice. We talked about policy perspective, we talked about position. Let's talk about practice. In Aaron Spink's book, that's a free download called New Voices and Perspectives in Volunteer Engagement. The references in the bottom of the slide here. One of the contributions was from Brandy Shanparo, who wrote a really compelling piece to inspire us to think about flexibility in our practices, particularly around training. Questions to think about and consider when you're reflecting on your training as we move forward here in late 2023. Can your training be hybridized and remain that way? What training is really necessary? I remember when I worked in the museum world, we had curators saying every volunteer in this exhibition needs to know all 37 species of prehistoric rhinoceroses. And we as educators were like, actually, they only need to know one, because they just want to get people looking in this diorama, and then they can direct volunteers to other places or visitors to get information elsewhere. So what's really necessary to get started? What's necessary is pre-service training and what can be done on the job. Are there sufficient team building opportunities for volunteers? And what's the best balance between required qualifications and training? Perhaps this all may seem a little obvious, but it's clear that many volunteer programs so reliant on retiree volunteers aren't considering how they will meet the demands of their organizations in the future if they aren't getting the volume and diverse pool of volunteers now. And the author, Brandy, continues saying, many people want to volunteer but need flexibility in scheduling and access to training that is easy and convenient and takes into account their needs in order to find a place for it in their busy lives. So, thinking about making volunteering more accessible, let's get your voices in the room. And Mike is going to launch a poll here. Curious to know how many of you, or if you have adapted some practices, you should see the poll popping up on your screen. Which ones have you adapted to make volunteering more accessible and more attractive to you? Have you adjusted training requirements? You should be able to select more than one. Have you adjusted and renewed your service requirements? Maybe change the location of volunteering? Are you exploring reimbursements or cost savings? And if there are others, please add them to the chat. And we're going to give you a moment or two. It looks like we have just about half of you responding. Keep those responses coming. And I'll share the results in just a moment. Okay. The results are coming in. And while the last few folks are responding, Kara talks about a fully online volunteer scheduling platform that allows volunteers to pick their own jobs. That's great. And times. Easy to organize a group to volunteer. Okay, great. And very flexible on training. Great. It's nice to see that we have quite a lot of flexibility built in there. Micah, if you want to, we'll close the poll in 3, 2, get your last answers in 1. Okay, and Mike is going to close it and share the results. We have 2/3 of you having updated training requirements, which is great. Nearly half updating service requirements. Also nearly half changing location of volunteering. And I'm really glad to see not quite 1 in 5 are exploring reimbursements or other cost savings for volunteers, which is awesome. So, so thank you for that. And Micah, you can stop sharing it now. I appreciate hearing those updates, and please check out your colleagues. There's lots of other notes, catering roles to meet volunteer interests, ability to substitute with online signups, lots of other ways that your colleagues or your peers are weighing in the chat to share how they are removing barriers. So we've talked about policy and perspective, positions. We talked about practice. Now let's get to personas. Fourth in our list. What are personas? That's the one that I mentioned that Kara Webster from CASA OC is utilizing, as are many others. And I had been exploring this prior to hearing from Kara. Personas are groups of like-minded individuals. And when it comes to volunteer engagement, it is considered a distinct pool of prospective volunteers that can be targeted in recruitment. Back in 2022, McKinsey and Company shared some highlights from a study that they were doing, not about recruiting volunteers, but about recruiting talent for the paid employment arena. They noted that people were quitting at record levels, yet companies were still trying to attract and retain them same old ways. And so they wanted to understand who are the talent pools and what are some methods that could really reach them more effectively. Because at that point, the voluntary quit rate, and I mean the personal choice to quit a paid job, was 25% higher than pre-pandemic. And ultimately, what they found was a mismatch between what companies were seeking for talent and the number of workers willing to supply it. And yet they examined statistics and conducted a global survey to determine what was driving people to stay and to leave, and applied these analytics to define specific segments of the workforce, both active and latent. And what they identified were these 5 personas. And I read this and I thought, this is practically the same wording that we talk about in volunteer engagement. Yes, it sounds a little bit like generations and there's some overlap, but it's not just age-based. It's really more about psychographics, not demographics. So what were the McKinsey identified personas? Traditionalists, do-it-yourselfers, caregivers, idealists, and relaxers. Let me share a little bit about each of these, and I'll share both who they are from the McKinsey standpoint and what I see as their relevance in volunteer engagement. And feel free to use the chat, share how you see they relate to volunteer engagement. First, we have traditionalists. They are the classic labor pool, the star of the classic labor pool, yet they won't be enough to keep the supply, both for paid jobs and I would say for volunteer roles as well, filled. These are traditionally career-oriented people who care about work and work-life balance, but are willing to make trade-offs for the sake of their jobs. And employers like traditionalists, like nonprofits and other volunteer involving organizations like traditionalists, because they have traditionally been easier to find through recruitment and they can provide this ongoing, reliable, every Tuesday 1 to 4 volunteer pool. But that has been waning long before the pandemic. We've been seeing this in the volunteer world. So we know that they're the easiest group to find with normal recruitment tactics, but also tend to be a pool that is still not necessarily returning in droves as they're aging and as concerns about health and COVID still relate to some of those or still affect some of them. We also have the do-it-yourselfers. These are individuals who are really out there for autonomy. This persona, which comprised the largest share of respondents of McKinsey's survey, values flexibility in the workplace and the volunteer place, meaningful work, and in the workplace compensation, but for the volunteer world, it tends to make a difference. They tend to be about 25 to 45 years old and run the gamut from self-employed to full-time employed and even part-time and gig workers. And so how do we attract them? In the work world, we do it through modularized paid employment. defining discrete, meaningful tasks that can be accomplished independently. In the volunteer world, it's about embracing flexible work environment and project-based short-term volunteering opportunities. Short-term flexible volunteer opportunities. This isn't anything new. We see caregivers. Hopefully some of these are sounding familiar to you and resonating with the people you're seeing who volunteer in your arena. Caregivers may be spending time at home, perhaps caring for older adults or for children, or both, as is the case for so many. And they have been, rock stars throughout the pandemic, but are really needing to balance that around a constellation of other priorities, right? Workplace flexibility, support for employee health and well-being, and even career development is really vital. So in terms of volunteering, again, there's overlap. Flexible, opportunities for growth, and support personal wellness. Do you offer volunteers a chance to explore and enhance their personal wellness through perhaps mission-related classes or trainings, etc.? Then we have idealists, students often and younger part-timers. Those idealists in this persona tend to be younger, 18 to 24. Many are students, and they tend to be the most unencumbered by dependents and mortgages and other responsibilities. So for careers, they want flexibility in career development and advancement potential and meaningful work, as well as a community. It's the same in volunteering. It's about they need to feel that they are being have a seat at the table, that they are included in a diverse environment, and they may have a chance to perhaps get mentoring. It makes me think of an organization that had, I kind of mentioned them a little bit, that had always hovered around 2,000 volunteers, the museum I used to work for. And after months of closure due to the pandemic, they were able to act upon some of the data that they had previously identified prior to the pandemic that showed that while recruitment was successful in attracting multiracial and diverse corps of volunteers by other measures, retention was not the same. Volunteers of color were leaving at a much higher rate than white volunteers. Why? Because the team leader structure that they had had in place for decades with peer volunteers leading teams of volunteers, it turns out in the world of the 20 teens and leading up to 2020, they found that that team leader structure was undermining the inclusive environment. And with the disruptions of the pandemic, they were able to rebuild with a completely different structure. Yes, they were able to expand staff, but also staff took up some of that leadership responsibilities. But then they leveled out the volunteer org chart, so it was much flatter. And as a result, they were able to nurture a much more inclusive culture of volunteer engagement, and volunteer retention is now much more level across all measures of diversity. So again, it's not just recruitment tactics, retention is intertwined with recruitment success as well. And a lot of that played into this, relates to idealists and their particular emphasis. DEI is a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. Thank you for asking for clarification on that. Another set of personas are the relaxers. It's a mix of retirees, those not looking for work, and those who might return to traditional work under the right circumstances. They may want more than the traditional value proposition to be enticed back in. And so we have to really make the opportunity sticky, really impactful, and make sure that they understand that there's belonging that they can gain from their time with your organization. So as I mentioned, so these were the personas that McKinsey articulated in the paid employment world. But I mentioned that CASA OC was developing a strategy to leverage personas. And they started by considering what personas already existed in their organization, which personas existed. And among their current personas, they identified the empty nester, who ironically, though not referring to me, was named Beth. and it sounds like me, a married mother whose children have recently flown the nest. She has a history of volunteerism through her own community and now has time to focus on her CASA role. That's a group of individuals that was representative of many of their current advocates. They also had retired professionals whom they named Jean, a recently retired teacher, therapist, social worker, or probation officer looking for ways to stay engaged with children. And the newer mom, whom they named Jenny, who stays at home with children or has a part-time job, but is, as their children are a little more self-sufficient, looking for ways to help other children. And for each, they considered likely age, gender, interests, and where CASA normally meets these individuals. But they didn't stop there. They said, who are our aspirational personas? They started with the professional go-getter, Ian, someone who works long hours at his professional job but makes time to commit to CASA, likes to be engaged in initiatives to support more youth, and is keen to recruit more male advocates. Next, they had their resume builders, whom they named Caitlin, currently working with youth while also studying child development or social work or law, and has been volunteering with at-risk youth through her college and wants to continue to build in this experience in the field while pursuing professional qualifications. Lots more about the Caitlin, but that's an interesting role because historically they had a few Caitlins, but staff found that these folks tended to only stay for one case, 1 or 2 years, and they viewed that as a burden. But Tara helped them shift their perspective and say, if I limit each case manager's load of Caitlins to just 1 or 2, so you don't have full turnover every year, then we should really be engaging these individuals because they're likely to come back to us later in their career, and they provide great value even now. And finally, they had the community conscious, Lizbeth, who heard the call for Latinx speakers or Spanish speakers and wants to support youth from her community, has a long history of volunteering with youth, tutoring and after school, and can be found at community events. So for each of these, they looked at who are our aspirational personas and then could prioritize recruitment strategies with clarity and intention and real measurable goals for each. So where do you go from here? How do you leverage personas and develop a plan? First, I encourage you to think about your policy and perspective. Review and assess your practices and make sure that they align with your goals and your real value that you're asking volunteers to provide. Review your positions and refine them as needed. And then think about personas. What are your current personas and what are your aspirational personas? So a few key steps to kind of sum all of that up. Audit your current volunteers so you know who they are and what personas they fall into. Think about how you can increase access and remove barriers, and then define what success is. And finally, identify prospective personas, and then you can personalize pitch. When you're auditing current volunteers, ask yourselves, whom are we currently attracting? And what demographic data do we know about them? What do we know about those who are leaving, are no longer current volunteers, right? Do you have exit surveys or can you conduct interviews? That's how the museum that I mentioned identified that volunteers of color were leaving because they didn't feel that they belonged. They did not feel included in the same way as other volunteers. How can you leverage your data and focus on transforming infrequent volunteers to more frequent? And finally, again, what can we learn from those who are not volunteering? Maybe don't think of everyone as non-volunteers, but instead think of them as not yet volunteers. In terms of increasing access, I just want to call attention to a couple different articles and tools that have suggestions about how to increase access and remove barriers. Things like thinking about, is volunteering the right word? The act of volunteering is universal, but the word is not across all cultures. So sometimes it just helps to talk about help out your community or help out at the school. Go where non-volunteers are found and hold sessions on what it means to be volunteers in their community. Create partnerships with representatives from the communities to help break barriers, etc. So you can create a couple of those different or embrace a few of those tactics to see if that can inform your practices. And finally, I encourage you to think about your recruitment and retention goals. How will you be defining success? One of the handouts you'll be receiving is a handout that can help you identify your current personas and think about what your current volunteers have in common and what are the successful strategies to recruit those groups of people. Then identify your aspirational personas. They may already be in your midst in small numbers and you want to increase, or they may not be in your midst yet. And then you can develop a targeted recruitment plan by asking, where will I find them? What would attract them? When's the right time to reach out? And who are the right people? It may not be me do the outreach, and what they need to know to outreach to these individuals. So you'll have a series of tools that will be able to be provided from Better Impact to you that can help you walk through those steps. And before we open it up for questions, I'll just share a couple key takeaways, and then we'll have about 8 minutes for questions. So first, just remember that more of the same recruitment tactics won't necessarily drive greater results, because new circumstances demand new approaches, not just for recruitment, but for engagement. If you are attracting people to something which is at its heart no longer appealing, no matter how loudly you scream or how widely you broadcast your message, people won't come, or certainly they won't stay. So consider which policies, practices, and positions may be barriers and make some adjustments. And then consider leveraging personas, pilot new recruitment tactics, and track your results so you know which innovations work and which experiments you have to learn from and maybe just retire because they didn't work so well. So with that, I wish you great success, and I open it up to questions. I see one of the biggest questions has been about the recording. There will be a link to the recording of this session in an email that you'll be receiving in the next couple of days. So stay tuned for PowerPoint slides in the PDF, as well as some of the handouts I've mentioned. And I will put in the chat as well my my website, which you can go to, where there are even more downloadable tools and templates in addition to the ones that Better Impact will be sharing. But at the moment, I'd love to see if there are any questions in the chat that I'd be happy to try to address. You're very welcome. Lots of great thank yous. You're very welcome. Love the welcome to the other newbies. Any other questions that anyone has, or great strategies that you have implemented that you think others can learn from? Totally open to that as well. See what the questions are. What is the difference between existing and aspiring personas? Existing are those who currently make up your volunteer corps. So for a lot of organizations, your existing personas may be, oh, we're mostly retirees, female, like I'll pick a museum, stereotypical museum. Our 300 volunteers who work as docents or as weekend tour guides or in our museum shop, or even in collections, are predominantly retired women who love art and who have been a longtime member of the museum. But our aspiring persona might be, we would like to have more students of any age at the college that is half a mile from our museum. And so our aspiring persona is, we would like students of art or history to be part of this. So what's the recruitment tactic? Oh, we might need to, maybe we have 3 or 4 of those, but we might need to create a bit of an internship program, or we might need to create partnerships with professors, or with a student campus community service office. Another aspiring persona might be artists. We might also decide that artists are should be paid for their work, but maybe we're looking for aspiring artists who are looking for opportunities to volunteer to lead workshops. Maybe we have one of those, but we'd like to get 10 of those. So that would be an aspiring one. I hope that addresses that. Tiny Marie asks, do you have suggestions for gaining the data on personas for current volunteers? Surveys, discussion, how do you choose aspiring personas? I think that's a real question. Interesting that we're on this call thanks to Better Impact. That really has a lot to do with what do you know about your volunteers already? Do you have a central database that from which you can glean some demographic data that you've already gathered due to applications? So you might know, a little bit about age, you might know a little bit about education levels, you might know a little bit about race or neighborhood or zip code, but then it's also about really asking questions and understanding what you know about kind of the psychology of the volunteers that you have. And you could engage a team of staff and volunteers, a little task force. Think about what are the personas and what do you know about volunteers, and try and put them, not literally put them in groups, but identify what are some of the commonalities, and then begin to brainstorm who else might you want to grow or reach out to. We recently thank you for that question. Taylor, we recently created a QR code to add to our volunteer flyers. It linked potential volunteers directly to the volunteer application page, which outlines the positions available, easy to do online. Love that suggestion. Everyone take note. Taylor, thank you for sharing it. I really appreciate that. Tara says, having trouble finding retired communities to target without them being seniors. Sorry, as our volunteering at the farm is quite active. Do I have any creative ideas? Well, I guess I wouldn't necessarily go to retired communities if you're not looking for seniors. So you might look to some other, there may be youth service organizations. I worked with some cities in Iowa that looked at horticulture groups and 4-H clubs to get younger volunteers. So that might be an example, but am I making that up that you said something about farm? Yes, it was horticulture related. And also I know a lot of community farms that engage families. Now it has to be safe and it has to be age appropriate for varied ages, but there are lots of families that seek opportunities to volunteer together, especially in organizations that allow volunteers under 14. And farms are one of the few organizations that can allow that, depending on nature of the work. So I'd also suggest, Kara, playing with family volunteer recruitment as well. Okay. Any last questions? I don't think so. Micah notes that if you joined today, there's a link posted to link into to try and receive your PDU, your professional development credits. And otherwise, again, I just want to thank Better Impact for the chance to present on this. And I wish you all great success and look forward to crossing paths with you in the real world or the virtual world again in the future. Thank you so very much. I do see a couple other questions. I'm willing to stay on for another minute, answer some of the questions that are coming up now. But if you want to wrap it up formally, Micah, since we're at our time limit, I'm happy to do that. And then I will just answer this question about culture. I can find it. I see someone is saying something about culture. I asked a question about culture. I don't know where your question is, Jim. I'm looking for it. Jim Short, ideas and thoughts on changing a culture in an organization which may be working against recruitment. Oh, Jim, saving the big toughie for last. Here's my quick answer. I think pilot projects are magic. I think if you can find 1 or 2 champions among your resistant colleagues who might be excited about the chance to recruit volunteers in new ways, to help them build their capacity, then I would encourage you to engage them in pilot project, which is an experiment, and it's a way to kind of approach it without indicating that you're going to be changing the way everyone does business. And that way you can get them to become champions and inspire their colleagues to change. That's one of the ways that I think are most that I've seen to be most successful. So with that, I'm sorry I missed some of the other questions, but I think I will, yeah, I think I will wrap up there. And again, wish you all great success. Remembering, as you see on the screen here, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. We need to be different. And I wish you, good effort and good innovations in recruitment. Keep your missions going strong for years to come. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.